Hi, James Crocker here with Crocker Realty. In this video, I'm going to go over what the new National Association of Realtor Settlement rules and our local rules are with regard to buyer agency compensation, transaction brokerage compensation, and compensation that's in your listing agreement. So I'm going to cover your buyer agency agreement, your listing agreement, your brokerage disclosure to buyer agreement, and then I'm going to talk about some of the items within those documents. I'm going to try to keep this under 15 minutes if possible. So I'm going to go pretty quickly. So first of all, brokerage disclosure to buyer or seller. If you are meeting with a potential buyer or a potential seller in any circumstance, it has nothing to do with the compensation that we're talking about in this video. This is in any circumstance. If you're going to meet with a seller that's potentially going to list their house with you, and you start discussing confidential information with them, which could encompass a lot of things, before that's done, you need to have a brokerage disclosure to seller signed. And you can, in that situation, you can either check that you're a transaction broker or that the seller is a customer. As you get through that conversation, if you sign a listing agreement and you become their agent, that's going to override whatever is in that brokerage disclosure to seller. But if you're discussing confidential information with them, and that might be something as simple as what their last name is, or how much they owe on the house, how much they want to list it for, all of these things, what their motivation is, where they're going, all this stuff could be considered confidential. A lot of that is going to depend on who you ask. The same is true if you're meeting with a buyer. If you are representing a seller, and even if in the case where you're not representing a seller and you're just going to show this buyer houses, as soon as you get into a situation where you're about to discuss confidential information with that buyer, you need to have them do a brokerage disclosure to buyer. In that case, you can either do the customer box or the transaction brokerage box if you're in Colorado. Later on, if you do a buyer agency agreement, that's going to override whatever that document says. If you do the customer box in the brokerage disclosure to buyer, you do not have to put a commission amount on the last page, because at that point, you're not representing them. They're just a customer. I'll get into that in more detail here in a minute. So I just wanted to clear that up right out of the gate. In Colorado, the Colorado Real Estate Commission does not require a touring agreement. They do not require a buyer agency agreement. They do not require a brokerage disclosure to buyer for you to show a house. However, they do require you to provide a brokerage disclosure to buyer before discussing confidential information with the buyer. They also require you to, the MLS system in our state, or in Denver, that is, requires you to have some kind of compensation agreement or touring agreement. In this case, it's going to be a buyer agency agreement or a brokerage disclosure to buyer before showing houses. So although that's not a Colorado state law, it is part of our MLS rules. So I would suggest that you follow that. So you must do a brokerage disclosure to buyer before discussing confidential information. Let's say you're doing an open house. You're the listing agent on the open house. If someone walks in there and they start telling you about what their motivation is, why they're moving, brokerage disclosure to buyer. You need to do that immediately, okay? What happens if you show a listing that you're not the listing agent on to a buyer that called you off of Zillow and they wanted to go see it? Let's say that you provide them with a brokerage disclosure to buyer, you check the customer box. You do not have to put a compensation amount on that last page. However, if you go show them that house, 2 days later, they could call up the listing agent directly, make an offer, and you're cut out of the situation. So that's the risk you're going to take if you put them down as a customer. If you put yourself down as a transaction broker in the brokerage disclosure to buyer, and you put that percentage on that back page, you can make that property specific for that specific property. And if they decide they want to make an offer, at that point, you can go ahead and do a buyer agency agreement if they want to, or you can just continue on as a transaction broker. In most cases, they're going to want you to be their agent at that point if you're making the offer for them. But whatever that amount is in that document, whether it's the brokerage disclosure to buyer or the exclusive right to buy, that's basically what you're entitled to get from them should they choose to buy that house and the transaction is consummated. Now, if you're the listing agent and you're representing the seller and you get a call from a buyer that wants to see that house, you need to do a brokerage disclosure to buyer. However, you can treat the buyer as a customer at that point. And actually, I would recommend doing that, because if you treat the buyer as a customer, like I said, you do not have to put a commission amount on that last page. Let's say that your seller agreed to pay you 6% commission and you're going to pay 2.8% of that to the buyer's agent per your listing agreement with your seller. If that buyer chooses to buy that house and they're a customer, you're keeping the whole 6%, okay? The amount that you're offering to buyer's agents for buyer's agents compensation is not going to apply at that point. You will keep the whole 6% in that scenario. If you choose to be the buyer's transaction broker, which I would not recommend, because these strangers that you don't know, you haven't filled, that you're going to basically be asking them to fill out this brokerage disclosure to buyer and sign this, that's offering a commission amount, right? If that is done and they're okay with that, that's fine. Let's say that's 2.8%. The seller's paying 6% total. You're still getting 6%. You're basically paying yourself the 2.8%. You're keeping the full 6%. It's the same either way. The difference being that if you're a transaction broker for the buyer versus them being a customer, you have more duties to the buyer than what you would if you were their transaction broker or their agent. So that covers the broker's disclosure to buyer. Always do that before you discuss confidential information. Exclusive right to buy. So this is your agreement with your buyer. Always check the success fee box and put whatever percentage in there that you want to put in there. You can take less than that if you choose to. Let's say that amount is 2.8. You decide to go make an offer for your buyer. The listing agent's offering 2.5%. You can go ahead and take the 2.5 if you want. You don't have to do an amendment unless you want to. Anything less than that amount is fine. Anything more than that amount, you need to that's going to be a problem. So you need to determine what that is. In most cases, you're going to put 2.8%, okay? Underneath the success fee, it's going to say you have a few options. Always check the listing brokerage may pay, buyer is obligated to pay, right? If you don't check that box, you're not going to get paid, potentially, if the listing agent's not offering a commission. So you always want to check that box if you want to make sure that you're going to get paid at the closing of the transaction. So with regard to the buyer agreement, it's pretty simple. Just make sure that you're filling that section of the buyer agreement out correctly. The listing agreement. You'll have to excuse me. I'm going to read some things off of this here real quick, off of the listing agreement itself. If buyer's brokerage firm procures a buyer, the transaction results in a closing of the sale of the property to such buyer. Seller's brokerage firm may enter into a compensation agreement with the buyer's brokerage firm to contribute the sale compensation in an amount of X amount of percentage or dollars. In this case, this is basically what your seller is going to offer as commission. Again, if you're representing the buyer, whether you're the transaction broker or they're your customer, and they are unrepresented by another agent, in other words, if you're double ending the deal, you will keep that full amount that the seller is offering. So just keep that in mind. Now, what if the seller doesn't want to pay buyer's agent's commission? Number one, you have the choice of whether or not you want to take the listing at that point. You could say, you know what, I don't want to take the listing. Have a nice day. You don't have to enter into a listing agreement with someone if you choose not to. That's your choice. What I would do is explain to them why it may not be a good idea not to offer commission. The pros and cons of that, okay? If you're in a super hot market, maybe you don't offer commission because maybe the buyers will come out of the woodwork and pay it, okay? They'll go ahead and pay their agent. That could happen if the market's super hot like it was 3 or 4 years ago. But in most cases, guess what's going to happen if your seller doesn't offer a commission? One of two things is going to happen. One, the buyer may not look at the house. They're going to reduce the amount of activity they're getting. The agent's going to call you. They're going to say, hey, how much commission are you paying? 0. Guess who doesn't show the house? That's going to happen a lot. That's going to reduce the demand for the property, and that could have an impact on the price. Number 2, what's the other option? They decide to go ahead and come and show it, knowing that you're offering 0% or that the seller's offering 0%. And they go to make an offer, and guess what? They offer 20 grand less for the house. Or they go ahead and offer full price and ask for a $15,000 concession to cover the commission to the buyer that the buyer would have had to pay to their buyer's agent. Or, they come to make that offer. They ask for either of those items. They ask for the seller to pay, whether it's through a higher price or through a concession. And the seller says, no, they're gone. In most cases, they're gone. Unless that buyer really, really wants the house, they're just going to go find another house. There are other houses out there that are paying 2.8%. So rather than telling the seller, hey, I'm not taking the listing unless you offer a commission to the buyer's agents, because they're not obligated to do that, explain to them why it might be a good idea for them to offer a commission. Let's say that you're in a situation where you have multiple offers. You get 10 offers on the property. They're offering well over asking price. One thing that might come up is the seller might ask you, hey, let's take away our commission that we're offering to the buyer's agent. Let's do an amendment to our listing agreement and take away whatever commission we're offering to the buyer's agent. The buyer can go ahead and pay that themselves since they're going to offer $20,000 over asking price or whatever the case may be. I would not recommend doing that. That is an option, but I wouldn't recommend doing that. Just negotiate a higher price for the seller. If they get 20 grand more for the house on the price, they're going to get that money in that regard, right? So that's going to be an easier way to do it, and you're not going to piss off a bunch of buyer's agents by switching gears and then saying, hey, we're not offering a commission anymore. I would not recommend doing that. Just negotiate a higher price. Okay, contract to buy and sell. At the bottom of the contract to buy and sell, section 29, there are 3 options. One is basically an agreement that the seller is going to pay this amount to the buyer's brokerage firm. In most cases, this is the amount where you're going to put the amount of your compensation in there. You can put whatever amount you want in there up to whatever your buyer agreement says if you're representing the buyer. So if your buyer agreement says that the buyer is going to pay you 2.8%, you could put whatever you want in there up to 2.8%. And I would recommend in most cases just putting the 2.8%. It doesn't matter what the seller is offering. Okay, the seller might be offering 1%. You can still put 2.8% in there. If the seller agrees to that contract, they're agreeing to pay 2.8%, period. So you don't have to put what the seller's offering. You can put whatever you want in there up to what you've agreed upon that you're going to get paid by your buyer, right? So in that case, the buyer probably doesn't want to pay you any commission. So the seller, you asked for 2.8%. Worst case, they're going to counter you or they're just going to reject your offer. The second option there is section 29.2. This is a situation where your buyer is actually going to pay you all the commission. In that case, it's pretty simple. The buyer's paying me this much. When everybody signs that, you already have the agency agreement with your buyer, but you're also getting this in writing in the contract to buy and sell as well. The third option is going to be utilized by some brokerage firms, and basically this is what we call a brokerage compensation agreement. It is a separate document that the listing agent has signed by their seller along with their exclusive right to sell. And basically this is something they would provide to buyers agents, disclosing how much they're offering as far as commission is concerned. We're not doing this with my company. Some companies will do it. So let's say that the listing agent sends you a brokerage compensation agreement where it says that they're offering 2.5%. If that's the case and everybody has signed that and agreed upon it, and let's say that your buyer agency agreement says that your buyer is going to pay you 2.8. You could still go ahead and do 2.5 if you want. That's totally fine. You don't have to ask your buyer for the other 0.3%, although you could. Obviously, you need to let them know about that on the front end because they are obligated to that. Or you could just go ahead and just eat the 3.3% and take the 2.5. Now, if you wanted to go ahead and try to get the whole 2.8%, what you could do is check 29.3, which is the brokerage firm's compensation agreement that the seller is offering, which in this case would be 2.5%. And you can go ahead and check box 29.1 and put the other 0.3% in there. So now the seller is essentially paying you 0.3%. And their brokerage firm is paying you the 2.5 because they have the agreement with their brokerage firm. They're paying them 2.5 for buyer's agents. They're going to pay you the 2.5, but that doesn't mean the seller can't pay the other 0.3 out of their proceeds. So in that case, you could check both boxes. 99% of the time, you're just going to do 29.1, put the amount in there, 2.8% or whatever you have agreed upon with your buyer, and you're good to go. Okay. If they counter you, they counter you. You can deal with it at that point. If you're a Crocker Realty agent and you're the listing agent, we're not doing a brokerage firm compensation agreement. They're going to just offer the amount in section 29.1 if you are getting an offer from another agent. Pay attention to what is written in there. If your seller is only wanting to offer 2.5 and you get an offer and that buyer's agent puts 2.8 in there and everybody signs this contract, your seller's paying 2.8. And they're not going to be too happy about it. In that case, what's probably going to end up happening is if in your listing agreement, your total commission is 6% and they've paid you agreed to pay you 2.5 to buyer's agents, they're going to be a little upset now. They're having to pay 2.8. So in that case, if you want to be doing the right thing because you didn't inform them about this on the front end, you might need to go ahead and just go ahead and eat that other 0.3% yourself and amend your listing agreement to change that amount to 2.8. so that your seller's not paying that 0.3. They need to know up front. And I would recommend, if you send an offer to them where that amount in section 29.1 is higher than what your listing agreement says, you put that in writing. When you send them the offer in that email, say, hey, I know our listing agreement says 2.5. This buyer agent and the buyer is asking for 2.8 from you. They make it really crystal clear. It is in the contract, but your job is, you have a fiduciary duty to make sure that your seller understands what's in this contract. So I would highly recommend text message, email, something documenting that if that amount is higher than what the seller is actually offering. Just a couple more quick items and I'm going to wrap this up. Should you show properties that are not offering a commission? Leave that up to your buyer. Explain to your buyer, hey, 123 Main Street is on our list of showings today. They are not offering a commission. In other words, you might have to pay the commission on that one if you go see that house if the seller refuses to pay. Let your buyer make that decision. Do not just eliminate it on your own, because that could be considered steering. Hey, I'm only going to show properties that are offering a commission amount. It's very possible that your buyer does choose to go see that house, and then you go ahead and negotiate some commission from the seller when you make the offer, whether it's through a higher or a lower purchase price or a concession that's going to allow your buyer to go ahead and pay that commission to you. Or section 29.1, you can still put an amount in there. It's up to the seller whether or not they want to pay that amount. But do not just eliminate listings. Let the buyer make that decision. Let your buyer make that decision. Do not, under any circumstance, show the listing agent your buyer agency agreement if you're representing the buyer. If you're representing the seller, do not under any circumstance show the buyer's agent or the buyer your listing agreement. It's none of their business. It's between you and your client, period. It's not their business what's written in there, all right? You do not have to provide that to them. That's a confidential document that's been signed between you and your client. They're going to take your word for it. That's it. If you have 2.5% in your buyer agency agreement as your compensation, and the listing agent and the seller are offering 2.8%, you're only allowed to take 2.5 because that's what's in your buyer agency agreement. You have to honor what is in your buyer agency agreement. If you go ahead and try to take that 2.8, you're not going to send them a copy of your buyer agency agreement, okay? But if you get caught doing that, it's going to be a problem, okay? So don't do that. Whatever your buyer agency agreement says you're being compensated, if the listing commission that's being offered is higher than that, you're still taking that lower amount because that's what you've agreed to in your buyer agency agreement. One last thing, okay? This is going to cause some controversy, but the rule right now is that your compensation, if you're the listing agent, that you're offering to the buyer or the buyer's agent cannot go in the MLS system, right? It can't be put in there, but I've heard nothing about whether or not you can put it in the showing instructions, in the showing service, right? I've been putting mine in the showing service, okay? When they go to schedule that showing, they're gonna get some showing instructions. Buyer agent compensation offered by the sellers, X amount of dollars. This is a separate system from the MLS, right? The MLS doesn't own Showing Time or Broker Bay or whatever showing service that you're using, right? Now, this could be a problem later on. The MLS might make some restrictions on that, but it's an MLS rule, not a showing service rule as far as I know. So for the time being, I have no problem with you putting your commission amount in the showing service. You don't have to do it that way if you don't want to. Agents are just going to call you and ask you what it is. So if you just want to do it that way, that's fine too. Again, as far as the brokerage disclosure to buyer is concerned, I know I covered this already, but technically it's not Colorado law that you need to have a touring agreement before showing a house. It's MLS rules. If you violate the MLS rule and someone finds out about it, you could get fined for that. Okay, probably not going to lose your license because that's a Colorado thing, but you could get fined by the MLS. Regardless, though, that brokerage disclosure to buyer or seller, depending on who you're talking to, needs to be executed before you discuss confidential information with them. And that's why I require it on all of our files, because at some point, usually before you get into signing a listing agreement or a buyer agreement, you're going to be discussing confidential information with them. You need to have that signed. If you're doing an open house, as soon as someone walks in that door and they start talking to you, have them sign it. They're just a customer at that point. They're not obligated to anything. There is no commission percentage on the back of that document if they're being treated as a customer. But they need to know that you're representing the seller, assuming that you are representing the seller and you're not doing an open house for someone else. Guys, if you have any questions, let me know. Feel free to make a comment on it on this video. I'll answer any questions I see in the comments. I'm not an attorney. Do your due diligence on your own. I take no legal obligation for any of this. It's just my interpretation of the new rules, and I've done some due diligence on it. So I think I've covered everything to the best of my ability, and I think all of this is pretty accurate. But do things at your own risk. All right, you got to always put that legal disclaimer out there to remove any liability, right? You don't want to get sued for something. Anyway, best of luck to everybody. Again, if you have any questions, just make a comment or reach out to me directly. My number is 720-235-7388. Have a great day.